Worst president in history. The words dripped from Donald Trump's mouth like venom, slicing through the air before Barack Obama could even open his folder. Gasps rippled through the San Jose Civic Auditorium. Over 3,000 people, half of them on their feet, the other half frozen in disbelief. Trump leaned in, eyes locked on his rival, his voice booming. "You left this country with 10% unemployment, the slowest recovery in decades, and a border in chaos." The crowd roared and jeered, but Obama didn't flinch. He simply placed a single sheet of paper on the podium, numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and waited. Because what was about to unfold wasn't just a debate, it was a demolition. And in less than an hour, the man calling himself the best president ever would be fighting to explain why his own Treasury report proved him wrong. The San Jose Civic Auditorium wasn't just full, it was alive. The air itself seemed charged, as if every molecule knew it was about to witness history. Over 3,000 people pressed into every inch of the room. Rows upon rows of bodies filled the floor, the balcony, the aisles, some leaning against the walls because there wasn't a seat left to take. The sound in the air wasn't quite a roar and wasn't quite a whisper. It was the steady, swelling hum of thousands of conversations blending together, like the ocean building toward a wave. And above it all, suspense, thick, invisible, but inescapable. Two podiums stood at center stage, angled just enough toward each other to invite confrontation. They weren't just props. Tonight they were weapons, each one the base of a coming assault that would be fought with words, facts, and the force of personality. The lighting was surgical, bright enough to erase shadows, exposing every twitch of the mouth, every narrowing of the eyes. It made the stage look like a courtroom stripped of comfort, a place where there would be no hiding. When the announcer's voice finally rolled over the crowd, the effect was instant. Every head turned, every voice dropped. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 44th and 45th Presidents of the United States, Barack Obama and Donald J. Trump." The applause didn't break evenly. It swelled on one side like a sudden storm. Cheers, whistles, and shouts. On the other side, the sound was steadier, heavier, almost like a heartbeat keeping time. Trump came first. His stride was deliberate, chin tilted upward, that familiar half-smirk playing across his face as if he already knew he'd won. Every movement was calculated for the cameras, pausing just long enough to catch the light, scanning the room as though sizing up his prey. The reaction was mixed but loud, his supporters on their feet, fists raised, drowning out the low rumble of boos. Obama entered seconds later, his pace unhurried, his eyes moving deliberately across the crowd. If Trump was a showman, Obama was a surgeon. Every step measured, every glance purposeful. The applause he drew wasn't as chaotic, but it was deeper, steadier, and it didn't fade as quickly. They met at center stage for a handshake. It was brief, stiff, their grips tight enough to leave an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Neither man looked away. The moderators stood to the side, their expressions betraying what everyone in the room already knew. This wasn't going to be a polite exchange of ideas. This was going to be a fight, one in suits, but a fight nonetheless. Behind the curtain minutes earlier, the contrast had been just as stark. Obama's side of the prep room was quiet, papers neatly stacked, a single pen, a glass of water. He wasn't here to improvise or bluff. He was here with receipts. Trump's side looked like a command center in chaos. A stack of note cards lay scattered across the podium, a Sharpie bleeding ink onto the wood. Advisors had been whispering in rapid bursts, shoving charts and unemployment figures into his hands, rehearsing attack lines one last time. It wasn't preparation, it was scrambling. Back in the present, the first question hung in the air. But before the moderators could even set the rules, Trump leaned toward his mic, eyes narrowing at Obama. "Worst president in history." The words landed like a punch thrown before the bell. The crowd gasped, some with delight, others with anger. But no one looked away. Trump didn't wait for a response. "You left this country broken, record unemployment, businesses shuttered, borders overrun, and now you want to stand here and lecture me?" The jab was sharp, meant to draw blood early, and for a moment it seemed like he'd seized the energy of the room. But Obama didn't answer immediately. He simply adjusted his papers, took a sip of water, and glanced up. "I came here tonight to talk to the American people," he said finally, his tone steady, "and to talk about the truth, not the version that fits into a soundbite." The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a ripple through the audience, the calm before the first real strike. The moderators, sensing the need to move forward, began the introductions again, but the opening exchange had already set the tone. Every viewer, whether in the room or watching from home, knew they weren't just seeing a political discussion. They were watching two men with unfinished business, two men with legacies on the line, two men about to fight for control of the story America would remember. And as the camera zoomed in, one lens trained on Trump's taut jaw, the other on Obama's composed stare, it was clear. This wasn't another town hall. This was going to be a night someone would not walk away from politically unscathed. Trump emerged first, chin lifted like a general surveying his troops, his stride slow but deliberate, as if each step was rehearsed to match the rhythm of the applause he expected. The stage lights bounced off his suit, tailored to project power, while the faintest curl of a smirk played at the edge of his mouth. Half the room erupted in cheers, waving signs, pumping fists into the air. The other half met him with sharp boos that cut through the noise like knives. Trump didn't just hear both sides, he thrived on them. Conflict was fuel, and this was a full tank. He paused mid-walk, eyes sweeping across the audience like a performer gauging his crowd, head tilting slightly toward the cameras. It was the body language of a man who had been here before, not just in debates, but in battles where the crowd's reaction was as much a weapon as any argument. He reached his podium and gripped it lightly, his thumb brushing over the edge. It was a subtle signal to himself: hold the ground, own the space. Then Barack Obama entered. No rush, no theatrics. His pace was unhurried, almost casual, like a man walking into a room he'd been in 1,000 times. His gaze moved deliberately from one side of the auditorium to the other, not just scanning, but seeing. If Trump's entrance was a flare, Obama's was a tide. Silent, steady, and impossible to ignore. The applause for him didn't spike and fade. It built and held as if the sound itself refused to let go. He wore a measured half smile, not smug, not timid, just enough to suggest that he knew exactly what he was walking into and exactly what he planned to do once he got there. The energy in the room shifted. You could almost hear the audience recalibrating, some leaning forward, others folding arms as if bracing themselves. They met at center stage. The handshake was short, stiff, hands clasped firmly, their shoulders squared just enough to hint at the invisible tug-of-war beneath the gesture. Their eyes locked, and for a brief second, the noise of the crowd faded, leaving only that silent duel of gazes. It wasn't just a greeting, it was an opening strike, a test of will, a message without words. "I won't blink first," and neither did. The moderators stepped forward. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They knew they weren't about to referee a bipartisan discussion. This was going to be a controlled explosion. The lights intensified, erasing any shadow that might offer cover. The podiums, angled just slightly toward each other, now felt like combat positions. Between them, an invisible line was drawn, and everyone in the room knew it would be crossed before the night was over. Trump adjusted his microphone, tapping it twice for effect. It was a small move, but it pulled the crowd's attention back to him. He glanced at Obama's stack of papers and let out a quick, almost imperceptible chuckle. It was the kind of laugh meant to undermine, "You think your papers will save you?" Obama didn't react. He was flipping through the pages, his eyes moving with the calm precision of a chess player studying the board. The crowd's energy was electric, split almost perfectly down the middle. To the left, MAGA hats and campaign buttons caught the light like tiny embers. To the right, hand-painted signs reading "Truth Matters" and "Integrity First" stood tall above the sea of heads. It wasn't just political alignment, it was tribal, and each tribe had come to see their champion land the first real hit. Trump's fingers drummed against the podium, his body leaning slightly forward. He was ready to pounce at the first opportunity, ready to set the tone on his terms. Obama stood upright, hands resting lightly on either side of his podium, almost motionless. If Trump's posture said attack, Obama said endure and counter. The moderator's voice cut through the air. Gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. We'll begin with opening statements, 2 minutes each. But before she could finish the sentence, Trump leaned into his mic, his voice booming with the weight of practiced provocation. Worst president in history. The crowd erupted, half in applause, half in outrage. It was the opening jab, thrown before the bell, meant to rattle the opponent and claim the first moment of dominance. Obama's gaze stayed level. He reached for his glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. I came here tonight to talk about the truth, not the version that fits into a soundbite. That was the first shift. The applause wasn't as loud as the one for Trump's insult, but it was steadier, more deliberate. And in the eyes of many, steadiness in the face of fire speaks louder than the fire itself. Somewhere in the audience, a man in the back row whispered to the woman beside him, "This is going to get ugly." She didn't look away from the stage. "Good," she said. And just like that, the table was set. Two podiums, two men, two entirely different approaches to the same battlefield. The first blows had been exchanged, not with facts, but with presence. The night was young, the crowd was primed, and both men knew the real fight hadn't even started yet. Trump leaned in first. The microphone caught the sharp inhale before his voice filled the hall. Rapid, assertive, rehearsed just enough to sound effortless. He began with the greatest hits of his presidency, each line delivered like a headline meant to be read aloud. Record job numbers, the strongest stock market in history, pandemic relief faster than any nation on earth. His words came like a volley of artillery, fast, loud, relentless. And every time he paused, his supporters responded with the rhythm of a rally. Cheers, whistles, chants of 4 more years. To his half of the room, he wasn't just speaking, he was confirming what they already believed. Each statistic he threw out was greeted with nods and grins, as if the numbers themselves were irrefutable proof. But on the other side of the auditorium, the reaction was different. Arms folded, heads tilted, eyes narrowed. They weren't buying it. Not the numbers, not the tone, not the certainty with which he declared them. To them, it felt like a salesman's pitch, polished to gleam, but hollow under the surface. Trump's voice grew stronger, riding the wave of his side's applause. "We've done more for the American worker than any administration in history, period. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you." The line was bait, tossed into the air between them, daring Obama to bite. Obama waited. He didn't shuffle his papers. He didn't clear his throat. He simply let the last echo of Trump's applause fade until the room's attention was forced to reset. Then he stepped forward, not physically, but in tone. The warmth in his voice was immediate, almost disarming, but beneath it was a steel that demanded attention. "I appreciate the optimism," he began, the faintest glint in his eye, "but recovery isn't real unless it's felt at the kitchen table." The sentence was simple, deceptively simple, but the effect was instant. You could almost hear the air shift, like a window being opened in a room that had grown too warm. People leaned in, unsure if they just heard a gentle observation or the first cut of the knife. Obama didn't stop there. "It's not just about how the markets are doing. It's about whether the single mother in Des Moines can afford groceries without choosing between rent and electricity. It's whether the small-town mechanic in Pennsylvania can keep his doors open without taking on crushing debt." The imagery was vivid, almost tactile. You could picture the dim kitchen, the unpaid bill on the counter, the shop floor with its smell of oil and steel. This wasn't policy talk. It was a reminder of the America outside the walls of the auditorium. An America that didn't live in statistics. Trump's lips pressed together, just slightly, but enough for the cameras to catch. It was the look of someone feeling the first brush of irritation. Obama continued, his delivery measured. "Numbers can be framed any way you like, but families can't frame their reality. If they're working 2 jobs and still can't pay the bills, it doesn't matter how good the stock market looks from here." This time the applause wasn't explosive, it was rolling. It started small, then spread, sustained by people nodding as they clapped, like they were affirming something they already knew in their bones. And just like that, the first hairline crack appeared in Trump's wall. The moderators glanced at each other. They'd seen it too, not in the crowd, but in the subtle way Trump's posture shifted forward as if to reclaim ground. "Well," Trump cut in, the speed of his words ticking up, "under my administration, more Americans are working than ever before. Wages are up, businesses are thriving, the economy is stronger than it's ever been, and people are doing better than they were under yours." His crowd roared again, but this time, the cheer felt like it was pushing back against something rather than celebrating. Obama let it stand for a moment, then, without raising his voice, answered, "I'm not here to debate who gets the credit. I'm here to make sure we're honest about the challenges that remain. Because pretending we've already won the race doesn't help the people still running it." The analogy landed like a quiet punch, unexpected but heavy. Even some in Trump's section stopped to process it. Trump smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know, Barack, you had your chance for 8 years, and now you want to come here and tell me how to do my job?" The room bristled. Supporters on each side stiffened like boxers hearing the bell. Obama didn't flinch. "I'm here," he said evenly, "because the American people deserve clarity, and if I see misinformation, no matter who it comes from, I'm going to speak up." The cheer that followed was the loudest yet from his half of the room. Trump gripped the podium a little tighter. For all his skill at commanding a crowd, this was the one thing he couldn't control. The moments when calm truth drew more strength than a barrage of boasts. And as the moderators moved to the first audience question, the energy in the auditorium had shifted in ways both men could feel. The opening moves had been made, the gambits were on the board, and somewhere deep inside, each knew the same thing. The night's real blows were still to come. The moderator adjusted his glasses, glancing at a card in his hand before looking toward the middle rows. Our next question comes from Laura Benton, a small business owner from Flagstaff, Arizona. The camera found her, a woman in her late 40s, hair pulled back in a neat bun, hands gripping the microphone like it was both a lifeline and a weapon. Her voice, when it came, was steady, but you could hear the weight in it. "My store applied for pandemic relief last year," she began. "We were told we qualified, we were approved, but the funds never came. By the time I realized it wasn't going to happen, I'd had to lay off 2 employees. One of them had worked with me for over a decade. I want to know, what went wrong?" The room seemed to contract, the buzz of side chatter dropping away. It wasn't just a policy question, it was a wound, laid bare in public. Trump moved first. He leaned toward the microphone, voice taking on a sympathetic edge that sat just beneath his usual confidence. "Well, Laura, first of all, I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said, the familiar rhythm of political consolation rolling off his tongue. "But I can tell you that your case is an unfortunate exception. The vast majority of businesses got their relief quickly. We had the most efficient rollout in history, faster than any other country, maybe ever. If there was a delay, it was because of state-level red tape, not us. We gave the money out. That's the truth." He smiled faintly as though the matter was now closed. A few cheers came from his section of the crowd, quick and loyal, but they didn't swell the way they had earlier. Obama had been quiet while Trump spoke, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. But as soon as Trump finished, he straightened, his expression sharpening, not into anger but into precision. "Laura," he began, his voice steady, "what you experienced wasn't an isolated glitch. According to the Treasury's oversight report from last quarter, and I'm quoting here, over 120,000 small business applications were approved but never funded." He paused just long enough for the weight of the number to sink in. That's not an exception. That's a pattern. The shift in the room was immediate. Whispers spread like ripples across a pond. Some audience members leaned toward each other, repeating the number, 120,000, like it was too large to process all at once. A few heads turned toward Trump, as if silently asking for his rebuttal. Others just nodded slowly, the edges of grim smiles tugging at their lips. Trump's jaw moved before his words did, as though his mind was scrambling to grab the right response. "That's not true. That's absolutely false." Obama's reply was almost surgical in its calmness. "It's your Treasury report," he said, holding up a paper so the camera could zoom in on the header, "dated February 8th of this year. Anyone watching can look it up." The applause that followed wasn't the roar of a rally. It was the sharp, echoing clap of people who knew they just witnessed something land exactly where it was meant to. Laura herself looked startled, Her eyes flicked between the two men, then settled on Obama with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't just that he'd answered her question. It was that he'd done so without sidestepping, without drowning it in platitudes. Trump's tone hardened. Barack, you know very well that's not the full story. You're cherry-picking. We had fraud prevention measures. We saved billions of taxpayer dollars by making sure the money went to the right people. Obama's expression didn't shift. Fraud prevention is necessary, he agreed. But when that prevention turns into paralysis, the people it's supposed to help are left behind. And the irony is, while legitimate businesses were waiting, some of the largest fraud cases came from companies with the fastest approvals. The line landed like a punch. Gasps mingled with applause, and somewhere in the back, a single low whistle pierced the air. Trump shook his head, muttering into the mic. Ridiculous. But the damage was visible. The confidence that had carried him through his opening statement had thinned, replaced by a defensive edge that the cameras didn't miss. The moderators tried to steer the conversation forward, but the energy had shifted. Laura's story had given the debate something raw, something that couldn't be brushed aside with charts or talking points. For the first time that night, Trump wasn't the one dictating the pace. Obama was. And as they moved to the next question, the moment hung in the air, a quiet but undeniable reminder that, in this kind of battle, not every blow needs to be loud to draw blood. Laura sat down, microphone in her lap, her face a mix of vindication and lingering frustration. She had asked what went wrong, and now in front of millions watching at home, she had her answer. The moderator's gaze swept across the room, landing on a man in the third row. Our next question comes from Frank Dalton of Toledo, Ohio. The camera zoomed in. Frank was in his 60s, the kind of man whose posture still carried the discipline of hard labor. His hands, broad, weathered, and permanently marked with the faint scars of factory work, tightened around the microphone. He stood slowly, like the act itself was deliberate, not rushed. When he spoke, his voice was gravelly, shaped by decades of shouting over the noise of assembly lines. I worked 38 years in the auto industry, he began, his eyes fixed squarely on Trump. Paid my taxes, raised my kids, did everything by the book. And last year, I lost my pension when my company filed bankruptcy. The room went still. You could hear the faint hum of the lights above, the subtle creak of chairs as people leaned forward. So I want to know, Frank continued, why billion-dollar corporations got relief faster than working folks like me? Trump straightened his shoulders, adjusting the mic with a small flick of his wrist. His tone shifted into something halfway between empathy and explanation. Frank, I'm sorry for what happened to you. I really am, he said, his voice softening just enough to register on camera. But when the economy shut down, we had to protect the big companies to keep them from collapsing. If they go down, millions of jobs go with them. We saved the system, and saving the system saves workers. The answer was clean. Textbook. The kind of response designed to sound both logical and compassionate. His supporters applauded, nodding at the familiar logic. But the applause didn't spread. Obama hadn't moved while Trump spoke, his hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. When the moderator's eyes turned to him, he didn't hesitate. Frank, he said, his tone calm but weighted, the corporations you're talking about took the money, paid their executives bonuses, and still cut jobs. He let that hang for a second. That's not saving. It's looting with permission. The eruption was instant. On one side of the room, cheers, loud and unrestrained. On the other, gasps, murmurs, a few shouts of protest. The phrase was a blade, sharp enough to split the room in two. And it did exactly that. Trump's jaw tightened, the muscle at the corner flexing under the lights. He leaned toward his mic, his voice losing the measured calm from a moment ago. That's not fair. You're twisting it, Barack. You're making it sound like I handed out cash to my friends. That money was to protect the economy, and it worked. Look at the markets. Obama's head tilted slightly, the faintest suggestion of disbelief in his eyes. The markets aren't the measure of a man like Frank's life, he replied evenly. You don't retire on the Dow Jones. You retire on the pension you earned. This time, the applause surged higher than before, rolling across the room in waves. Even some who had been cheering for Trump earlier stayed quiet, their expressions unreadable. The moderator raised his hand for calm, but the energy in the auditorium was different now. Frank's story had shifted the ground beneath them. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about flesh and blood consequences. And for viewers watching at home, it wasn't hard to imagine their own father, brother, or neighbor standing where Frank stood. Trump tried to pivot, his voice quickening. You love to act like you've got all the answers, Barack, but you didn't rebuild the auto industry. You just threw taxpayer money at it. Obama didn't blink. I didn't throw money at it. I demanded accountability for every dollar. And when we saved those auto jobs, we didn't let CEOs take home bonuses while cutting pensions. There was no rise in his voice, no extra punch to the delivery, just a simple, pointed contrast, and that made it hit even harder. Frank slowly sat back down, microphone still in his lap. His eyes lingered on Obama for a moment before dropping to the floor. The camera caught the smallest of nods, almost as if he'd gotten more than just an answer. He'd gotten an acknowledgement. The moderators tried to redirect the conversation to job creation statistics, but the shadow of Frank's question lingered. It was the kind of moment that didn't just move the debate forward, it redefined it. And somewhere in the controlled chaos of the room, you could feel the momentum tilt. It wasn't a knockout, but it was the second clean hit of the night, and it belonged to Obama. The moderator's voice cut through the lingering applause. Our next question comes from Bryce Carter, a recent college graduate from Omaha, Nebraska. The camera panned to a young man in his early 20s. His suit didn't quite fit, shoulders a touch too wide, sleeves a fraction too long. But he held himself with the poise of someone determined not to be dismissed. He cleared his throat and spoke into the mic, his voice steady but carrying the faint tremor of someone who knew he was about to address two presidents on live television. My friends and I are just starting our careers, he began. We've heard a lot tonight about jobs and recovery, but for people my age, how can we be sure that economic growth will actually reach us? That we'll have stability, not just work? The question landed differently. It wasn't about the past, it was about the future. And in a room where half the audience was over 50, it was a reminder that the stakes went beyond immediate wins and losses. Trump jumped in before the moderator could even turn to him. Bryce, we've already made it happen. Young people today have more opportunity than ever before. Companies are hiring straight out of school. Wages are up. We've unleashed the American economy like never before. There's never been a better time to start your career. He spoke quickly, with the confidence of someone laying down a well-used talking point. The crowd on his side applauded, but it was polite applause, not the chest-thumping cheers from earlier in the night. Trump smiled toward Bryce as if the answer were self-evident. Then it was Obama's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't speed up. Instead, he looked directly at Bryce like he was having a one-on-one conversation in a crowded room. Bryce, some opportunities are better than others, he began. It's true there are jobs, but over 40% of the ones going to young people right now are part-time or gig work. No benefits, no retirement plan, no health coverage. He let the sentence settle, his gaze moving briefly over the crowd before returning to Bryce. That means no stability, no security. And without those, it's hard to build a life, hard to buy a home, start a family, or even plan for the future. The air in the room shifted. Older audience members, parents, grandparents, leaned forward in their seats. They weren't just hearing about numbers. They were picturing their own children, their own grandchildren, struggling under the weight of uncertainty. Obama pressed on. We can't measure success only by how many jobs exist. We have to ask what kind of jobs they are and whether they give people the foundation to build on. Trump's lips twitched into a smirk. You're talking like it's all bad, Barack. It's not. People are doing better now than they were when you were in office. Obama turned slightly toward him. Donald, if that were true for everyone, Bryce wouldn't be asking this question. And the reality is, too many young people are piecing together 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. That's not opportunity. That's survival. A low murmur spread through the room. It wasn't just applause. It was the sound of an audience agreeing with the premise before even realizing they were doing it. Bryce's eyes flicked between them, his expression thoughtful. The camera caught the moment. 2 visions of America's future laid bare in front of him, one promising a boom, the other warning about the foundation it stood on. Obama wasn't finished. You can graduate into a job and still be stuck if it doesn't cover rent, or if losing a single paycheck means you can't afford health care. That's not the kind of future we should accept for the next generation. The applause was steady, not explosive, like the crowd was weighing the truth of it and finding it hard to ignore. Trump leaned on the podium, cutting in. We've cut taxes, reduced regulations, and brought jobs back from overseas. That's the best thing you can do for young people. Put more money in their pockets. Obama's reply was immediate. Cutting taxes for corporations doesn't guarantee families see a dime of it. What helps families, and young people starting out, is lowering the cost of essentials, childcare, healthcare, housing. When those costs go down, paychecks stretch further. People can breathe. That last phrase, people can breathe, hung in the air. Simple, human, unarguable. The older crowd reacted first, soft claps building into a wave. Some in Trump's section stayed still, but even they didn't boo. The moderator, sensing the moment, moved to the next question. But the exchange lingered in the minds of those watching, both in the room and across millions of living rooms nationwide. This wasn't just policy. It was about whether the next generation would inherit an economy that worked for them or one that forced them to fight for scraps. And in that moment, you could feel the shift. The older viewers, many of whom had lived through decades of promises and disappointments, weren't just listening to numbers anymore. They were thinking about the faces around their own dinner tables and wondering which vision of the future would keep those faces safe. Obama didn't rush it. He let the room breathe, let the low hum of murmurs settle into a stillness so complete you could almost hear the stage lights buzzing overhead. Then, with his hands resting lightly on the podium, he leaned forward. Not much, just enough to shorten the distance between himself and every ear in the room. His voice, when it came, was low, but unmistakably clear. You can't claim victory just because you threw a parade while people were still digging themselves out of the rubble. For a moment, the words just hung there, suspended in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Then the reaction hit. Gasps first, sharp intakes of breath, followed by an eruption of applause that rolled through the room like a breaking wave. It wasn't the wild, chaotic cheering of partisans. It was something heavier. Cheers mixed with stunned laughter, as if people were realizing in real time that they just heard the line they would remember long after the night was over. Trump's mouth opened to fire back, but the roar of the crowd drowned him out before he could form the first word. It was the rarest of political moments, where the momentum shifts so suddenly, so completely, that even the cameras catch it. The close-up on Trump's face told the story. The brief flicker of disbelief, the tightening at the corner of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes as the applause refused to die down. The moderator tried to regain control. But the sound swallowed her voice whole. The applause built again, not louder, but deeper. Clapping that didn't feel like it came from one side or the other, but from the gut. A ripple of knowing passed through the crowd. That was the hit, the one you could build a headline around. Obama didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped back from the mic, hands clasped lightly in front of him, letting the reaction play out as if he'd already moved on. And that, more than the line itself, made it sting. It wasn't delivered as a zinger. It was delivered as if it were simply the truth, obvious and undeniable. Trump finally forced his way back into the conversation. Folks, the truth is, we had to move fast. And when you move fast, sometimes mistakes happen. But overall, we did better than anyone could have. His words were strong, but they landed softer than he intended, smothered by the echo of Obama's metaphor still bouncing around the walls. Obama leaned in again, but his tone was measured. Mistakes are human, Donald. Pretending they didn't happen? That's politics. And the American people deserve the first one, not the second. The crowd roared again, a second wave cresting on the heels of the first. Somewhere in the back, a man slapped the railing and shouted, "That's right!" It cut through the noise, raw and unscripted. Social media was already ablaze. In living rooms, bars, and on the screens of glowing phones, the clip was being clipped, captioned, and shared before the moderators had even moved to the next question. On Twitter, someone had already typed it out in bold letters, "Parade in the rubble." Underneath, a freeze frame of Trump mid-blink, Obama mid-lean, retweets climbing into the thousands in minutes. The moderators finally managed to transition to the next audience member, but the tone of the room had shifted irrevocably. Trump's side of the audience had fallen quieter, not silent, but subdued in a way that hadn't been there before. Obama's half sat taller, their applause quicker to rise, their murmurs more confident. It wasn't a knockout, but it was the cleanest strike of the night so far. A sentence that cut through charts, claims, and counterclaims, landing not in the mind, but in the gut. And somewhere deep inside, Trump knew it. The man who thrived on controlling the stage had, in that moment, been forced to share it with a line that would outlive the broadcast. His hand tapped the podium, once, twice, 3 times, as though marking the beat of a fight he now had to change. Obama, meanwhile, was already listening to the next question, eyes forward, demeanor unchanged. It was the unspoken message behind the strike. I don't have to chase you. You'll come to me. The cameras caught the contrast in a split screen, one man visibly working to reset the moment, the other standing still, waiting for the next opening. And just like that, the night moved on. But the phrase, parade in the rubble, did not. It lingered in the air, in the audience's minds, and in the feeds lighting up across the country. It was the kind of moment that sticks not because it's loud, but because it's true. From that moment forward, the rhythm of the night changed. Trump's words began to spill out faster, the sharp edges of his consonants hitting harder, as if sheer force could shove the conversation back under his control. The interruptions came more frequently, sliding in before a question was fully asked, cutting into Obama's answers before they reached their final beat. His hands, once resting on the podium with casual authority, were now in motion, slicing the air, chopping downward for emphasis, jabbing toward the audience like he was driving each point directly into their chests. But every rise in his volume had an equal and opposite effect. It made Obama's stillness stand out even more. Where Trump's voice pushed, Obama's pulled. Where Trump surged forward, Obama waited, letting the storm rush past before stepping back in, with a sentence that landed like a precise hook to the ribs. It was the kind of contrast that didn't just play to the room, it played to the cameras. The split screen told the story without a single word. One man visibly fighting for control, the other standing calm in the middle of it. That's just wrong. Completely wrong, Trump barked, leaning toward his mic. You keep talking about problems, but we've had more success than any administration in history. Ask anyone. Obama glanced sideways, a small, almost imperceptible lift at the corner of his mouth. When he spoke, his tone was steady, almost conversational. Donald, history isn't measured by how loudly you talk about it. It's measured by what people are living right now. The applause came quickly, sharp and clean, cutting into Trump's attempt to keep speaking. The frustration was visible now, not just in Trump's words, but in the way his eyes flicked toward the moderators, searching for an opening to reclaim time, to steer the next question, to break Obama's pacing. But the moderators, perhaps sensing the shift, were no longer giving him easy runways. They let the back and forth breathe, even when it meant Trump's rebuttals were shorter than he wanted. At one point, an audience member from Kansas City began asking about pandemic relief delays. Before she could finish, Trump cut in, "That's the fault of Democrat-run states?" Obama didn't raise his voice. "Actually, that's from your administration's own Treasury audit," he said, holding up a document with the header facing the cameras. "It notes delays of 6 months or more, especially in rural areas. And rural areas don't have the luxury of waiting half a year for help." The applause swelled again, not the thunderous rally kind, more like the steady drumbeat of approval from people who knew they were hearing something grounded. Trump's voice spiked in response. "No one's done more for rural America than I have." But Obama simply waited for the noise to subside, then slid in his line. "Then rural America should be the first to feel the results, not the last." The audience reaction was instant, a mix of laughs, claps, and murmurs that pushed Trump's next sentence into the background. The contrast was becoming the story. Obama's pauses weren't just silence. They were traps, leaving space for the crowd to react, forcing Trump to speak over the very people he needed to win. And every time Trump did, the image was the same. One man speaking louder, the other speaking smarter. The frustration bled into Trump's body language. He shifted his weight more often, leaning on the podium with one arm, then the other, His notes, once spread neatly, were now shuffled into a loose pile. Every so often, he'd glance toward his team offstage, a flicker of eye contact, a silent question. How do I turn this? Obama, on the other hand, barely looked down. His papers stayed in order. He drank water between questions, not as a stall, but as if reminding the room that he could take his time. Midway through the segment, the moderators shifted to a pre-submitted question about wealth inequality. Trump pounced on it. The wealth gap's been exaggerated. People at every income level are doing better now than they ever were. That's what's important. Obama's turn came, and he didn't look at Trump. He looked straight into the crowd. If that were true, we wouldn't be hearing tonight from people who've lost jobs, pensions, or health coverage. The stock market isn't the country, and the average American doesn't live off a portfolio. It was another clean hit, and the crowd reacted with a mix of applause and knowing murmurs. Trump's interruptions grew sharper. He cut into the moderators. He cut into audience questions. Every time Obama started a point, Trump's voice would slice across, higher in pitch, quicker in pace. But the pattern had set. Each interruption only highlighted Obama's composure. And the more the contrast played out, the more the audience could see the difference. By the end of that segment, the tension was visible in Trump's shoulders, in the way he gripped the edges of the podium. His energy was still high, but it was no longer effortless. It was effort, straining to force the room back into his orbit. And Obama? He stood the same way he had at the start, upright, steady, unhurried, letting Trump burn fuel while he conserved his own. The crowd could feel it. The moderators could feel it. And somewhere deep inside, Trump could feel it too. The boil had begun, and there was still a long night ahead. The moderator scanned the cards in her hand, then looked up toward the middle section of the audience. Our next question comes from Michelle Alvarez, a registered nurse from Sacramento, California. The camera found her instantly, a woman in her 40s, still wearing her scrubs beneath a light jacket, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her hands gripped the microphone like she was bracing herself for impact. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that made the room lean in. My father was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, she began. He had insurance, good insurance, but between the deductibles, the co-pays, and the treatments that weren't covered, he had to declare bankruptcy before he died. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and unsettled. Michelle's eyes flicked from Trump to Obama, then back to the moderators. I've seen this happen to patients I care for, and now it's happened to my own family. What would you do to make sure no one loses everything they've worked for just because they get sick? Trump was first to answer. He shifted his stance, leaning slightly toward her, his voice adopting the practiced warmth of a politician, giving bad news as gently as possible. Michelle, I'm sorry for what your father went through, truly. But the best way to fix this problem is to make the market more competitive. Let insurance companies compete across state lines, bring prices down through competition. It's about giving people choice, not forcing one-size-fits-all healthcare on everyone. He spoke with conviction, but his solution was abstract, clinical, numbers and policy points without blood or bone. His supporters clapped, but it was a short, scattered applause. The rest of the room stayed quiet. Obama didn't look at the moderators. He looked directly at Michelle. Michelle, he said, his voice low and steady, I had a close friend whose father went through almost the same thing. Worked his whole life, paid into the system, thought he was safe because he had insurance. Then came the diagnosis, the treatments, the bills. He paused, not for drama, but because the weight of the story needed the space. By the time his father passed, the family had lost their home, their savings, everything. The room was silent. No murmurs now, just stillness. That's not just a number, Obama continued. It's a man's dignity gone. It's his family's security gone. And it's a system that says your worth is tied to your wallet, even when you're fighting for your life. The silence deepened. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavier than any outburst. Thick, unmoving, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the second row, a woman's hand moved to her mouth. An older man near the aisle dropped his gaze to the floor. Trump cleared his throat, his fingers tapping the podium in a quick staccato. Well, Barack, telling sad stories doesn't fix the problem. We need real solutions, not just emotion. Obama didn't turn toward him. You can't fix a problem if you don't understand what it does to people. Numbers tell you the scale, stories tell you the cost. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was sustained, long enough for the moderators to exchange a glance. It was clear who had connected more deeply in that moment. Obama took the opening to pivot from the personal back to policy. We need a healthcare system that treats illness without bankrupting people. That means capping out-of-pocket costs, expanding coverage for critical care, and making sure that insurance companies can't deny or delay treatment when time is the difference between life and death. His words came slowly, but each landed with the precision of a hammer driving a nail. Trump tried to reclaim the ground. And how are you going to pay for all that? Higher taxes? More government control? That's what people are afraid of. Obama finally turned to him. People are afraid of getting sick and losing everything. They're afraid of watching their parents choose between treatment and keeping a roof over their heads. If you're more worried about corporate profit margins than those fears, then we're not having the same conversation. The audience erupted, half in cheers, half in groans. But the moment was already sealed. Michelle lowered the microphone, her face a mix of gratitude and grief. She had come for an answer, but what she'd been given was recognition. Public, unambiguous acknowledgement that what happened to her father wasn't an isolated tragedy. For viewers at home, the contrast was stark. Trump's answer had been about the structure of the market. Obama's answer had been about the people living inside it. And in a night already marked by sharp exchanges, this one felt different. It wasn't just a blow, it was a reminder of why these debates mattered in the first place. The moderators moved to the next card in the stack, but the heaviness in the room didn't lift right away. Even as the conversation shifted, the image lingered. Michelle standing in her scrubs, speaking for her father, and two presidents showing the country two very different definitions of leadership. The moderator shuffled her cards, then glanced back toward Trump with a look that signaled a pivot, but not an escape. "Mr. President," she began, "earlier tonight, Frank Dalton from Toledo asked why large corporations receive pandemic relief faster than individual workers or retirees. Could you address that directly?" It was